Hi, my name is Dimitar and this is Yasen. We're here to talk about the influence of music and sound effects on immersive games. Me and him come from both musical and programming background. We have both graduated the Plovdiv Music School in Bulgaria, and also I'm playing the piano from age 4, and I think he's playing the guitar from the first grade. So we're here to share our insights and what worked for us for our game Moolender, which was in development for more than 7 years. Now, the talk will be split into 2 parts. I will share with you some insights on the music, and then Yasen will talk more about how we implemented the sound effects in the game. In the first part, we will cover topics like producing coherent soundtrack, how to choose your instruments, how to avoid repetitiveness, and much more. So, who this presentation is for? Well, it is intended for professional composers that want to gain valuable new insights on how they can potentially do their soundtracks. It is also for people that have a musical background and they're eager to start composing themselves. And lastly, because we are a smaller gaming studio, we compose primarily using VSTs, so most of the tips are especially valid if you're also composing with VSTs, basically. So, where to start when composing music for a game? Well, first, for a particular scene, you need to understand what feeling you want to convey. So, do you want the players to feel fear or anxiety? Do they want, should they be overpowered or adventurous? Then you need to identify, do you have any talking in the scene? Are there any special objects producing sounds? If they are, you need to leave those frequencies clear for the player so they can hear those things. And also you need to choose the overall style of your soundtrack. So we will go for a more classical Western ensemble type of soundtrack, or you prefer more of an ethnic Eastern feeling. We will have a full-blown percussive, or we will choose to do your rhythm with instruments like pianos and xylophones and marimbas. Whatever you choose, you should stick with it for the entirety of the soundtrack. Now, a couple of tips on how to make it sound coherent. So firstly, obviously, you need a melody, and you should not overthink it too much. You need something simple with a clear and distinctive rhythm. That way, you will have a lot of power to introduce it in many different ways during the entirety of your soundtrack. Then try to play that melody in as many different tracks as possible. You can spice it up, not play it one-to-one, but do some variations, change some little notes, play some parts of it, but ideally you want to play it in as many places as possible. And lastly, you should create contra melodies for important bits of your game. So, for example, if you have some villain, or if you have some really interesting biome, you can do their own basically melodies and play them alongside the main melody in their corresponding tracks. That way they will be much more impactful when they're seen in the game. So how to choose instruments when you're composing a particular track? Well, you should identify the biome where this track basically plays out. For example, if you make a track for a case terrain, you can choose instruments that play more distinctive notes, like pianos or marimbas. That way they will imitate the roughness of the terrain and will connect with it. Also, you should pick a contrasting instrument for the melody. The melody should be heard very clearly, at least from time to time during the entirety of your soundtrack. That will make it stick to the heads, in the heads of the players. After all, you want them to whistle it out after they finish playing your game, right? So, also, how can you be sure that the players are hearing the things that you want them to hear? Well, here are some insights on that. For example, for the melody, in order to make it more impactful, try to support it with a few other instruments that will play right alongside with it. Those instruments can be from the same instrument type. So, for example, if your melody is played by a cello, you can have a supportive viola or double bass that plays with it. They should also not be clearly distinguishable themselves. They should play with a lower intensity and just magnify the impact of the melody and not steal attention from it. Also, they can play some variations. You don't need to duplicate the melody in them. They can only support it with some of the notes. And lastly, if the frequencies around the melody become too cluttered, you can move some of those supporting instruments an octave higher or lower, and this turns out pretty great. But besides the supportive instruments, all other things that will steal attention should be lowered down or even removed when the melody kicks in. Basically, you want the frequencies dedicated to the melody to be really dedicated to it. And optionally, for VST recordings only, if you want to make the sound richer, you can duplicate what one instrument is playing onto another one to one. And more than one instrument from the absolutely same time playing the same thing. So for example, if you have a cello playing your melody, you can duplicate it into another cello from another VST library to make just the sound sounding richer. During build-ups, you also should try to be reactive with all of your instruments. It is especially tempting to just introduce more and more instruments until you reach the pinnacle of your build-up. But you should also lower down things that could interfere with the newly added instruments. That way, on the pinnacle, you will have this very distinctive moment and that the players will enjoy instead of a kind of a mash between too much instruments. Now, a couple of techniques how we avoided repetitiveness in the soundtrack of Moulander. Well, firstly, you can try mixing the section measure duration. So, for example, if you have a section that is 4 measures long, then you can follow it up with sections that are 3 or 5 measures long to freshen it up a bit to the user. Also, you inevitably have some loops in some of the instruments in some of your tracks. You should try to misalign those loops on purpose. So, for example, if you have a couple of percussive instruments, one of them can loop each 4 measures, the other one can loop each 3 measures, the other one 5 measures. That way, each new section will start with a fresh mix of those instruments, and that will bring variation to your tracks. For the build-ups, it is very good to pace them and instead doing them on a single build-up, especially if they are very long. You should do it in like a wavy pattern where each next wave becomes bigger and bigger until you finally reach the pinnacle of the build-up. And lastly, for the loops, if you need to repeat some loop a couple of times, try to freshen it up a bit and change up some of the rhythm, some of the notes. If you don't know what exactly to change, just experiment, try to even delete some of the notes in each of the instances of the loop, and it will sound much more interesting at the end. Now, when you're composing a track for a scenario, you know exactly how that track will play out. So you can be very distinctive and very specific in the way you build your track. You have full creative freedom over the tempo, over the instruments, over everything. But when you're composing for a biome, then that means that your track will probably be looping a lot of times, basically. So you need to create a lot of loop points. In order to do that, you should be much more conservative with changing the tempo or the instruments mid-track, basically. And you want all of your transitions to be much shorter in those tracks. Now we arrive at a couple of examples of some of the points we talked here. So the first one is from the Ori and the Blind, Ori and the Will of the Wisp game. It's a beautiful soundtrack, and in the example, the melody is played by a flute, and it is backed up by another instrument, violin, that plays with a lower volume, and that way the melody has much more richness to its sound. Next, we have a track from God of War. Actually, the next 4 examples are all from this one track. The first example will show how you're using complementing instruments to magnify the impact of the melody. So here you can hear a couple of instruments playing with a much lower intensity than the melody, but they make the impactfulness of the melody much bigger. or you can go and get the intensity on your complementing instruments up, and that way you have something like a duet between them and the melody. This also works very good for some tracks. Next is an example of avoiding repetitiveness. So here we have a section that is 4 measures long. That one is seven measures long. And the last one is only 2 measures long, and they even change the beats per measure here. Last example is for a build-up that is reactive, so they lower down some of the instruments during the build-up. Sorry, not that one. So here how the tremolo will disappear when the main melody kicks in. And with that, we are at the point where we will talk about the sound effects. So now Yasen will take over.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will quickly go through the whole process of creating sound effects. So the first steps, you need to identify and list all the sound effects. Then I'm going to talk about the problems that you are inevitably going to hit, and then how to implement properly the sound effects inside the game engine. So you're starting to work on the sound effects. First, you need to list everything that you need and possibly put it into groups. So you need UI sound effects for the menus, you need sound effects for the player sections, for the enemies, and lastly for the environment. Here, don't rush to start working on the sound effects too soon, because you want to have the aesthetics and the art of the game ready. Otherwise, if you do some certain sound effects and then you change the assets and the graphics or the particles of the game, you may hit the point where the effects that you have no longer represent what you see on the screen, and then you have to undo your work and start over again. So this is not a very effective way to do your job. Here you need to make sure to use the correct sounds. Obviously, the metal objects need to have metal sounds, and the wooden one should have wooden sounds. Start working on the most important sound effects first. So obviously you want to have all the sound effects related to the players, to their attacks, to the enemies, and then to move on to the ambient sound effects like the wind and the waterfalls in the background. And in the last mixing phase, you want to make sure that these most important sound effects are easy to hear by the users. This is done in the mixing phase. So here you have these two tricky types of sound effects. One are the repeatable sounds, so these are sounds that repeat very often, and the other ones are loopable sounds, which are essentially on loop. So a good example of sound effects that repeat very often are the player is constantly shooting bullets, or enemies are jumping and dashing all the time. And if you have the same sound played over and over and over again, the players can get very annoyed super fast, and they're just going to turn the volume down. So how to handle that? In the first place, don't make the sound effects annoying, obviously. You want to make sure that you have at least 2 variations of each sound. So they need to be a little bit different. They need to sound a little bit different, but still roughly the same. And ideally, you would have 3 or 4 sound files for each sound effect. And then you want to apply a random pitch randomization in the sound engine. In this way, each time you play the same sound, it pulls a different variant and with a little bit of different pitch. So each time the player hears that effect, it sounds a little bit different. And of course, don't spam the users with a lot of the sound effects, like the same sound effects over and over again over a couple of seconds. That is definitely annoying. The next tricky part are the loopable sounds. For example, you have lasers in the game and you have big sections with lasers puzzles. So you have, when the laser turns on, you have a loopable sound of the laser. And if you have very high-pitched sounds, they can be very intrusive to the ears. Or if you use too simple sounds, they can become dull very fast. So you need to be very careful what sample are you going to use for these loopable sounds. They definitely need to loop correctly. So you can imagine that if you have a sample which is 2 seconds long and it is not looping correctly and the players can hear where the sample is getting looped, it is super awful and it's very annoying. So you need to make sure that it is looping correctly without actually the users noticing that. Try to make the samples a little bit longer. In this way, you are going to make it easier for the previous problem that I just said, and it is going to make the sound a bit more interesting. And of course, you can apply the same ideas for the previous types. You can have different variations and different pitch variations, and in this way, each time that you play the loopable sound, it sounds a little bit different. Okay, so we have made all the important sound effects for the players, for the enemies, and now you can start working on the ambient atmosphere of the game. So here you can pull up a screenshot or a video of the game, just take a look at what you can see on the screen and highlight all the important sounds in the scene. So do you have water, or do you have winds and birds in the background? You need to highlight these elements in the sound that you create. Try to make the sample long, for example, like a minute or even 2 minutes, so the user doesn't notice that you are playing that sound on repeat, or make a multiple samples that you can loop randomly during the game, and in this way everything is going to feel a lot more natural. And finally, you implement that into the game. You just play the game, no running, no dashing, no combat. You just stand still, observe, and see if you did a good job on representing what you see on the screen and what you hear on your headphones. Now you have everything ready and you want to integrate it properly in your game engine. You want to use 3D audio. So essentially what 3D audio is, the enemies on the right side, you can hear them in the right speaker, on the left side, on the left speaker. You know that this is very important, for example, for shooter games and pretty much for every game. This makes of an immersive experience to the players, and it also gives them spatial awareness. So they know which object is where, even without looking at the screen. Keep in mind that not all sound effects should be 3D, so you have the menu sounds or some indication sounds like you're low on ammo or low on health. These obviously shouldn't be 3D. This is done pretty easily. You just attach the sound listener to the camera, and as the camera moves around the game, the sounds are moving as well. This works perfectly for 3D games, but with 2D games you're going to have that problem. So for example, you are zooming in and zooming out with the camera, so you're actually moving the camera towards or further away from the sound emitters, and the sounds are going to become more quieter or louder. So this is makes of a very strange feeling. So what you want to do is, here in this video you can see the static listener. So basically the camera zooms in and out, but the actual listener, the sound emitter, stays in one place, and in this way the volume stays constant. And now you want to do the mixing and the mastering of the whole audio. This takes obviously a lot of iterations, and you need to make sure that everything is the correct volume. So focus on the most important effects first, and then put all the other sound effects in the place of the mix. You need to consider different types of speakers, because some players are going to use headphones, some are going to play on TV or on speakers. So you need to test on all these devices, because they do not sound the same. So you need to know how your mix sounds on different devices. Most importantly, do not hit 0 decibels. So if you don't know, 0 decibels is basically the limit of your audio. So it cannot get any louder. And if you have a lot of loud sound effects, basically they cannot get any louder, and the sound engine just starts lowering down the volume of different sound effects. And this makes of unexpected results, and you don't want that. What you want is to create a quiet mix of the audio, and then when you're ready, manage the final loudness from the master bus. Again, test your final mix on multiple devices: cheap headphones, expensive headphones with noise cancelling, TV, speakers. Identify the potential problems with some of the devices. For example, on TV you may not be able to hear some sound effects, so you need to fix that and test again. So this is going to take some time. And lastly, in the settings of the game, you want to put the user into control of the mix. This is very important, so keep the music, the sound effects, and the dialogue's volume into a separate slider, so the user can control what they want to hear. And if you want to be extra cool, you can add more sound effect layers so the players can control them. For example, racing games are using this technique, and you can turn up or down the volume of the tires, of the engine, of the exhaust, of the surface. So for example, if I want to be able to more easily know when the car is sliding because I lost traction, I can just turn the volume of the tires up. So when the car loses traction, I'm going to be easy. I will hear very easily the tires, and I know that I need to correct my steering input. Yep.
Thank you for the insights on the sound effects. And here you can see the software that we used for the audio of Moorlander. So we recorded the music with Cakewalk, Sonar Platinum, and popular libraries like the Contact and FM8 libraries. Also, we have listed here some of our favorite VSTs and VSTs packs. So you should definitely check them out. And lastly, we are using the Fmod audio engine, which is very powerful and has a very good integration with Unity. And with that, we conclude our talk. So now it's time for your questions, I guess, and thank you. Yeah, I'm guessing somebody will give you a microphone, yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a really nice talk. I wanted to ask you guys, you were talking about the listener position in the relation to the camera in the 2D, and you told that you think that the good approach is to have a listener in one position where he would stay, even if the camera will zoom in or zoom out. And I think that it will probably work, but I am just wondering if this wouldn't introduce like this weird feeling that we are getting closer, we see something bigger, but the sound doesn't change. Wouldn't it like, break the immersion a little bit?
Yeah, good question. So obviously this really depends on the camera movement, if it goes very further away or very zoomed in. So it depends on the game. So for example, you can confine that listener to some position, not to be exact point on the camera, but to have certain type of movement. So you can still have that effect of going in and out. But it feels a bit weird if the sounds suddenly, if you zoom in and the sounds become very louder, because you do not understand why suddenly the game outputs higher noises of the environment or some other things. So it is very down to testing. So you can try different types of stuff, and you can also edit like the listener, because the listener is something like a sphere, and each sound emitter has like a sphere, so you can control the stuff, how big of the sphere is. So this is also another approach that you can use here. You can use the static listener, for example, make the listener sphere bigger or smaller. So you have different techniques, but definitely if the listener is connected exactly on the point of the camera, it makes of a weird feeling. This is what we first had in the game, and it is definitely not the thing that you want.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, that was nice talk. In terms of mixing the audio and mastering, you mentioned multiple output audio devices, and I would like to know what is your approach when it comes to this, let's say, problem. Do you like create like multiple mixes, like for example for headphones and another for TV and so on, or do you like manipulate with dynamic range or stereo image?
Yeah, very good question. Where definitely a lot of games are using these bit different mixes for headphones, for 5.1, for stereo. So you can use that. Mainly you want to at least, because this is going to take a bit more time to make the mix. Maybe you don't have the budget or the time to do that. So at least for the beginning, you want to make the mix sound roughly the same on the different devices. So it's not going to be the perfect thing on every device, but it's still going to work. So you want to make sure that the people on each device, they can hear what you want them to hear. And then when you hit that point, then of course you can do these other mixes for the different types of devices.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any more questions, guys?
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you again for having us here, and yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.